The neighbors laughed when the farmer built an underground grave instead of a house. They were sure he had made a mistake. But one night, everything went wrong, and it was his door that started knocking. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for the next ones. Watch our other videos and share this story with someone who should see it. The land had never lied to Mark Hale. It did not speak loudly, and it never explained itself, but it remembered everything. Every season left a trace. Every year carved a mark that only someone who stayed long enough could learn to read. Mark had been born on this land, raised on it, and had buried both his parents in the small cemetery 2 miles west, where the ground rose just enough to stay dry even when the river misbehaved. He was 48 now, his hair already thinning at the crown, his hands thickened by decades of work that no machine could fully replace. He was not sentimental about farming, but he respected it. Respect, he believed, was the only way land ever paid you back. The farm sat in the Midwest, in a county that rarely made national news. It was a place of long horizons and quiet persistence, where fields stretched farther than voices could carry, and weather determined moods more than politics ever did. The river ran east of the property, a broad, slow-moving body of water that locals like to describe as tame. It had banks reinforced decades ago, shallow bends engineered to reduce erosion, and a history that officials summarized with reassuring phrases like manageable floodplain and statistically acceptable risk. On paper, it was not a dangerous river. On the ground, it was something else. Mark had learned its habits early. As a boy, he had followed his father along the fence line at dawn, boots sinking into soft earth, where water lingered long after rain. His father had taught him where the soil stayed darker, where grass grew thicker even in dry years, and where frost lifted later in the spring. "That's where water waits," his father used to say, pressing a boot heel into the mud to show how long it took to spring back. It never leaves. It just pretends to. Those lessons stayed with Mark long after his father was gone. He noticed things other farmers overlooked because they trusted numbers instead of memory. He noticed how spring rains lingered longer each year, how the ground stopped drinking as quickly as it once had, how the river crept outward, not with violence, but with patience, spreading thin sheets of water across low ground, filling every shallow depression as if reclaiming something it had only ever lent out. The first warning had come 5 years earlier. That spring had been wet, but not alarming. The forecasts spoke of above-average precipitation, nothing more. Mark had been in the machine shed late one night, checking the seals on the combine, when he heard a sound he had not heard before. It was not rushing water or crashing debris, but a low, steady murmur, like breathing. He stepped outside and smelled it before he saw it, the unmistakable scent of wet earth and silt. The river had crossed its invisible boundary and was spreading through the lower fields, calm and deliberate. That year, the water stopped 50 yards short of the house. Neighbors gathered along the gravel road the next morning, hands in pockets, watching the river as if it were a spectacle. Someone joked that it looked peaceful enough to swim in. Another said it would all be gone in a day or two. The county trucks came by, measured levels, took photographs, and left. When the water receded, the fields were muddy but intact. Insurance adjusters walked the land, nodded, wrote numbers on clipboards. Life went on. The second warning came 3 years later, sharper and less forgiving. The rain started earlier and lasted longer. Mark remembered standing at his kitchen window one night, watching headlights reflect off water where there should have been soil. The river had not surged. It had simply refused to retreat. It crept closer to the house with a persistence that unsettled him more than any sudden flood ever could. That time, The water reached the edge of the gravel drive. The basement stayed dry, but barely. Pumps ran through the night, their hum echoing through the foundation like a heartbeat under stress. When it was over, one of the tractors sat half buried in silt, its tires locked in place, as if the ground had swallowed them in protest. The insurance company paid, but with reluctance. The letter came weeks later, polite and final, explaining that future coverage would require reassessment. The third warning arrived quietly, almost apologetically, in early spring of the year the story truly began. The winter had been mild, the snowpack thin but persistent. When the thaw came, it did not come fast. It seeped. Rain followed rain, each storm unremarkable on its own, yet relentless in accumulation. Mark walked the fields daily, pushing a steel rod into the soil to test depth and saturation. The rod slid farther each time. One evening, as the sun dipped behind low clouds, he noticed something that stopped him cold. On the old wooden beam inside the barn, where his grandfather had once carved dates to mark harvest seasons, there was a faint line of discoloration. Mark wiped at it with his thumb, then stepped back. He fetched a measuring tape and confirmed what his eyes already knew. That line sat higher than any previous mark. The water had never been there before. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with old county maps spread out before him, maps his father had kept folded in a metal drawer for decades. He traced the river's path with his finger, then followed the contour lines outward, noticing patterns that had been invisible when he was younger. The land sloped in ways that did not announce themselves to the casual eye. Some rises were gentle but decisive. Some low spots were deceptively shallow, yet fatal when water arrived. The next morning, the insurance letter came. It was not dramatic. No threats, no raised language. Just a clean explanation that due to repeated claims and updated flood modeling, full coverage would no longer be available for structural damage related to rising water. Partial policies could be offered at increased cost. Flood riders were excluded entirely. Mark folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He did not curse. He did not pace. He simply sat there and stared at the wall until the light shifted across the floor. The system he had trusted, the quiet assumption that someone else was responsible for disasters, had stepped away without apology. Neighbors reacted as expected when he mentioned it. One said insurance companies always overreacted. Another said the river had moods, and this one would pass. Someone suggested selling while the land still had value. Mark listened, nodded, and said little. He had already crossed a line in his thinking that they had not. The land was not changing its behavior to frighten him. It was doing what it had always done. It was memory that had failed, not nature. Over the next weeks, Mark began to study with a focus that surprised even himself. He pulled historical flood records from the county office, noting dates and reported levels. He spoke with older residents who had lived through floods that were no longer mentioned in official summaries. He learned which roads disappeared first and which never went under. He noticed that during every major event, one particular slope north of his house remained untouched, its grass unflattened, its soil firm even when everything below turned to slurry. He walked that slope one afternoon as the ground steamed lightly from evaporating rain. It was not high, not dramatic, just a steady rise, angled away from the river's natural spread. He stood there for a long time, feeling the ground beneath his boots. Dry, solid, patient. For the first time, the thought formed fully and without fear. If the water insisted on returning, he would not fight it where it was strongest. He would move where it was weakest. Not away from the land, but deeper into its logic. That evening, as rain began again in the distance, Mark stood on the slope and looked back toward the farmhouse below. The house had always been a place of safety in his mind. That certainty had cracked. In its place grew something quieter, but more durable. An understanding that survival was not about height or defiance, but about position. The land had warned him 3 times. This time, he intended to listen. The slope did not look like an answer at first. It was not dramatic enough to inspire confidence, nor imposing enough to impress anyone who believed safety had to announce itself. It rose gently from the lower fields, a quiet shoulder of earth that had never been plowed because it resisted machines and yielded little. Grass grew there in stubborn clumps, and wildflowers returned every year, no matter how often they were cut back. Mark had passed it thousands of times, without thinking of it as anything more than wasted ground. Now it occupied his thoughts with an insistence that surprised him. In the weeks following the insurance letter, Mark began to see the land differently, as if a map had been laid over reality, and he was finally reading it correctly. He spent evenings at the kitchen table with a laptop open, toggling between modern satellite imagery and scanned topographic surveys dating back nearly a century. He printed pages and spread them across the floor, aligning old river paths with current ones, tracing contour lines that revealed subtle truths hidden by flat horizons. What he learned unsettled him and steadied him at the same time. The river had not become more aggressive, it had become more patient. Where earlier floods surged and retreated, modern ones lingered, saturating soil until gravity and resistance meant nothing. Water no longer needed speed to destroy. It needed only time and space. The maps confirmed what his memory already suspected. Every major flood filled the same bowls in the land. Every retreat left behind the same scars. And every time, that slope remained untouched. Mark began walking the area daily, sometimes twice, marking elevations with a handheld GPS unit borrowed from a neighbor who used it for planting. He noted the highest documented flood levels from county records and compared them to the slope's base. Even at the worst recorded crest, the water had stopped short. Not because of luck, but because the land subtly turned it away. The realization led to the idea he had resisted at first because it sounded wrong even inside his own head. He would build into the slope, not above it, where wind and water could tear at exposed walls, not below it, where water would pool and press with silent force, but into it, letting the earth do what it had always done naturally. Shield, absorb, redirect. It was not a bunker in the sense people imagined. Mark did not picture concrete cylinders or sealed doors or a place to hide from the world. What he envisioned was quieter and more practical. A structure partially embraced by the land, with its back and sides protected by earth, its front oriented away from the river and toward higher ground. A place that did not challenge water, but denied it leverage. Once the idea took root, it refused to let go. Mark sketched at night, his pencil moving slowly, erasing often. He thought in layers. Ground first. Water paths. Drainage before walls. Walls before roof. He read about earth-sheltered construction, not the modern luxury versions designed for energy efficiency, but older approaches rooted in necessity. He studied how basements failed during floods and why some cellars survived where others drowned. Over and over, the same lesson emerged. Water was not defeated by strength, but by being given somewhere else to go. The slope offered that elsewhere. He measured it carefully, calculating how deep he could cut without reaching the local water table. He noted the soil composition, clay heavy but stable when dry, treacherous only when trapped water had nowhere to escape. That became his guiding rule. No trapped water. Ever. When he finally staked the outline, driving thin wooden markers into the grass, the shape looked odd even to him. It wasn't symmetrical in the way houses were supposed to be. It followed the slope's logic instead. Wider where the ground allowed, shallower where the earth resisted. It looked less like a building and more like an interruption in the land's surface. The first reaction came from his nearest neighbor, who slowed his truck and leaned out the window to watch Mark digging the initial trench. "What are you building up there?" he called. Mark wiped his brow and glanced down at the shallow cut forming the beginnings of a drainage channel. "Shelter," he said. The neighbor laughed, not unkindly. "You know that's the highest ground you've got. If water comes, you won't even see it from there." "That's the point," Mark replied. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small places. By the time the excavation reached full depth, people stopped by out of curiosity rather than concern. Some stood with hands on hips, studying the cut earth as if it might explain itself if stared at long enough. Others shook their heads openly. One man asked the question everyone else was thinking. "You know when floods come, basements fill first, right?" Mark answered calmly. He explained elevation. He explained slope. He explained drainage. Most listened politely and dismissed it the moment they drove away. The phrase began to circulate quietly at first, then openly. He was digging himself into the ground like an animal. Someone called it a mole hole. Someone else called it a tomb. The county inspector came one afternoon, clipboard in hand, expression carefully neutral. He asked about permits, about purpose, about whether the structure would be inhabited. Mark answered honestly. It would be a shelter. It would be used. It would not be connected to sewage or municipal water. The inspector frowned, flipped pages, and said he would need to review zoning classifications. He did not say no, but he did not say yes either. Mark continued. He dug the primary drainage trench first, a wide channel running upslope, angled carefully to intercept surface water before it could ever approach the structure. He lined it with fabric and filled it with crushed stone, creating a path of least resistance that would carry water away naturally. Below the planned floor level, he installed a second layer, deeper, designed to capture subsurface seepage and guide it outward. Every channel sloped deliberately, never flat, never allowing water to pause. Neighbors watched and laughed. "You building a moat for the wrong side," someone joked. Mark did not respond. He worked with a focus that left little room for embarrassment. Each step followed the logic he had committed to memory. Earth first, water second, structure last. The walls went up slowly, reinforced concrete poured against forms that hugged the excavation precisely. Waterproofing layers followed, thick and redundant, not because he feared leaks, but because he understood pressure. Water that cannot build pressure loses its power. He backfilled carefully, packing layers in stages, allowing no voids where water could collect and freeze or push. The entrance came last, cut into the side of the slope rather than the face. It angled away from the river, its threshold raised above any conceivable waterline. Ventilation shafts extended upward behind the structure, disguised among grasses and stone, capped with valves that closed automatically if water surged unexpectedly. Nothing protruded that could be caught or torn away. When it was finished, it looked like nothing. That was what disturbed people most. There was no house, no visible walls, no sign of effort commensurate with the labor Mark had invested. From the road, it appeared as a grassy rise with a narrow doorway partially hidden by terrain. Someone said it looked like he had buried something he did not want found. Mark heard it all and said little. He did not argue because argument assumed uncertainty. He had none. He did not need approval. He needed readiness. As spring advanced, rain clouds gathered with unsettling frequency. Forecasts began to shift in tone. Phrases like saturated ground and prolonged systems replaced the usual optimism. Mark finished stocking the shelter quietly, bringing in water, batteries, supplies, and tools. He tested airflow, monitored humidity, and sat inside during storms just to listen. The earth muted sound in a way that calmed him. Rain that would have been deafening on a roof became a distant presence, filtered and softened. One evening, as thunder rolled low and persistent across the horizon, Mark stood outside the shelter and looked down toward the river. The land between was already darkening, water collecting where it always did. He thought of the laughter, the disbelief, the warnings that he would drown first. He went inside and closed the door. Behind him, the slope held its shape, silent and unbothered, as if it had been waiting all along. The rain did not arrive like a threat. It came the way spring rain always did in that part of the country, in long gray curtains that softened the horizon and blurred the edges of things people trusted to remain solid. The forecasts had warned of a slow-moving system, then two, then a third, stacking behind them, but no one spoke of disaster. Not yet. The language of concern stayed technical, wrapped in percentages and cautious phrasing that suggested inconvenience rather than danger. Mark watched the sky with the patience of someone who no longer trusted first impressions. The ground changed before the river did. That was always the first sign. Fields that normally drank rain greedily began to shine instead, their surfaces slick and unyielding. Tractor ruts filled and remained filled. Ditches stopped draining overnight. The earth reached a point of refusal, not dramatic, not visible to anyone who did not walk it daily, but absolute all the same. By the fourth straight day of rain, Mark knew the threshold had been crossed. Neighbors still talked about river levels. They drove down to the bridge and leaned over the railings, peering into the brown water below, judging danger by height alone. Phones came out. Pictures were taken. Comparisons were made to past years. "Still got a ways to go," someone said, repeating the phrase like a charm. Mark stayed away from the bridge. He walked the low ground instead, watching how water gathered and moved. It did not rush. It did not surge. It spread. It found every shallow depression, every subtle dip the plow had never corrected. It crept through grass and between fence posts with the quiet determination of something reclaiming space it had never truly surrendered. On the fifth day, the first pump failed. It was not dramatic. There was no spark, no bang. It simply stopped pushing water where it had always pushed water before. The ground around it had softened enough that suction became useless. Mark shut it down and marked the spot in his mind, adding it to the growing list of systems that assumed conditions would return to normal if given time. Time was exactly what the rain refused to give. Electricity went out that evening, not just on Mark's farm, but across the lower part of the county. Lines sagged under weight they were not designed to carry. Transformers shorted when water found paths through insulation that had never been tested this way. Emergency alerts buzzed phones with instructions that arrived too late to matter. Still, there was no panic. Not yet. The river rose steadily, its surface widening rather than climbing. It crossed field boundaries without ceremony, turning roads into shallow streams and parking lots into reflecting pools. Water surrounded houses before it entered them, isolating families on small islands of higher ground. People moved valuables upstairs, convinced that elevation alone would save them. Mark loaded the last of his supplies into the shelter at dawn on the sixth day. He worked methodically, checking lists he had memorized months earlier. Water sealed, batteries charged, ventilation functioning. He left the door open and stood outside for a long moment, listening. The sound was different now. Rain still fell, but beneath it was another noise, low and constant. Not rushing water, but movement. The sound of saturation, of pressure finding release. By mid-morning, the river officially breached its banks. Sirens wailed somewhere to the south, distant and strained. county trucks attempted to reposition, then gave up when roads vanished beneath water that did not appear dangerous but refused to drain. Helicopters were mentioned on the radio, then dismissed as unnecessary. "Monitor conditions," the voice said. "Avoid low-lying areas." Low-lying areas were almost everything. Mark closed the shelter door for the first time. Inside, the air was cool but steady, carrying the faint mineral scent of earth rather than the damp rot people associated with underground spaces. He checked the gauges he had installed himself. Simple instruments, but reliable. Humidity stable. Airflow steady. No vibration in the walls. He sat and waited. Outside, the water reached the gravel drive and flowed over it, as if it had always been meant to. The farmhouse stood firm, its foundation elevated just enough to avoid immediate intrusion. But Mark did not mistake that for safety. He had learned the difference between delay and protection. By late afternoon, the first house downriver took on water. It happened quietly. A neighbor's basement, reinforced and pumped, filled anyway when groundwater rose beneath it, faster than pumps could remove it. Pressure did the rest. Water came up through the floor, not in a rush, but in a spreading sheet that soaked insulation, warped wood, and silenced electrical systems in minutes. By the time the family realized what was happening, the lower level was lost. Word traveled fast then. Calls came to Mark's phone, at first casual, then edged with confusion. "You seeing this?" someone asked. "Any idea how bad it's going to get?" Mark answered honestly. He said he did not know when it would stop, only where it would go. The rain did not stop that night. Darkness made everything worse. Without reference points, people misjudged depth and speed. A pickup stalled when water reached its intake, blocking a narrow road that had served as the last dry route out. Emergency crews pulled back for their own safety. Radios crackled with updates that contradicted one another. Mark stayed inside the shelter, listening to the muted world beyond the walls. He could feel the presence of water, not against him, but around him. The slope did exactly what he had trusted it to do. Water approached, slowed, and turned aside, guided downward and outward by channels cut long before the rain began. The difference between his position and everyone else's was not distance. It was orientation. Sometime after midnight, the rain eased slightly, though the damage was already done. Water now occupied every low place it could reach. Houses that had seemed safe hours earlier were suddenly islands surrounded by brown stillness. Lights flickered out one by one as backup generators failed or ran dry. Mark checked his phone again. Messages had changed tone. "Are you okay up there? You still dry?" One message came from the neighbor who had laughed first. "We can't get out. Water's everywhere. How bad is it by you?" Mark typed a response slowly, choosing each word. "I'm dry. Shelter's holding." There was a pause, then another message. "You mean that thing you built?" "Yes." The water did not behave the way people expected because it never had. It did not crash or surge or announce itself with violence. It surrounded. It waited. It pressed from below and from the sides, exploiting every assumption built into modern structures. Homes, built for wind and cold, found themselves vulnerable to something simpler and more patient. Mark's shelter did not resist the water. It denied it access. The entrance faced away from the flow. The ground around it sloped outward, shedding water without effort. Drainage channels whispered softly as they carried excess away. There was no pressure buildup, no force seeking entry, just absence. By morning, the county issued its first evacuation advisory, though many had nowhere left to go. Boats appeared, piloted by volunteers navigating what had been roads hours earlier. Mark stepped outside briefly at dawn and surveyed the land from the slope. The view was unreal. Fields had become a shallow inland sea, broken only by fence lines and the tops of submerged signs. The farmhouse stood isolated, water lapping at its base. He went back inside and closed the door again. The day passed slowly. Water rose another foot in the low ground and stopped there, as if unsure what to do next. The rain returned briefly in the afternoon, heavy but short-lived, then moved east at last, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the storm. It was in that silence that the first knock came. Mark heard it faintly through the shelter's walls, a dull, irregular sound that did not belong to the land itself. He sat still, listening, counting the seconds between impacts. The knock came again, closer this time, accompanied by a voice carried thinly through the earth. He stood, heart steady, and moved toward the door. The water had come the wrong way for everyone else. For him, it had come exactly as expected. Mark hesitated only long enough to be certain that what he heard was not the imagination of a man alone with his thoughts. The knock came again, closer now, followed by a voice that broke unevenly, as if the speaker had been shouting into wind for hours. "Mark, it's us!" He unlocked the door and pulled it inward. Cold, wet air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of river water and fear. Two figures stood just outside the threshold, their clothes soaked to the knee, faces pale in the dim light. It was the neighbor who had laughed first, the one who had slowed his truck weeks earlier to joke about digging holes. His wife stood behind him, one arm wrapped tightly around their teenage daughter, whose eyes were wide and unfocused. Mark stepped aside without a word. They entered hesitantly, as if expecting the ground beneath them to give way or the walls to close in. When the door shut behind them, the silence was immediate and startling. The constant presence of rain and wind vanished, replaced by the muted stillness of packed earth and controlled air. The daughter began to cry, not loudly, but with the quiet release of someone who had been holding herself together too long. "Is it safe?" the woman asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mark nodded. "You're dry now." They stood there for a moment, absorbing that single fact. Dry. It sounded unreal. Within minutes, the knocking began again. Word traveled fast when nothing else could. In a landscape cut into islands, the knowledge that one place remained intact spread by shouted conversations across water, by phone messages passed from one failing battery to the next, by the instinctive pull toward the only visible certainty. Families moved through water that reached their thighs, then their waists, guided by headlamps and memory. Some came by boat, paddling carefully to avoid debris hidden beneath the surface. Others walked until they could walk no farther and called out into the darkness, hoping the slope was as close as it appeared. Mark opened the door again and again. Each time, the scene repeated itself in small variations. Shock, disbelief, relief that bordered on collapse. People entered expecting damp walls and stale air, only to find a space that felt improbably calm. The temperature remained steady, cool but not cold, held by the earth itself. Breath did not fog. Clothing began to dry slowly, not through heat, but through balance. By midnight, the shelter held more people than Mark had ever imagined allowing inside. Families sat shoulder to shoulder along the walls, children curled against parents, older men standing quietly because sitting felt like surrender. Mark adjusted the ventilation carefully, opening intake and exhaust in measured increments, watching for signs of air growing heavy. He explained what he was doing in simple terms when asked, not because he needed to justify himself, but because understanding steadied people. "The air moves on its own," he said to one man who stared at the ceiling as if expecting it to drip. "Warm air rises, cool air pulls in. The ground keeps it from changing too fast." "Why isn't it wet?" someone else asked, Because the water never stops, Mark replied. It's always moving somewhere else. Outside, the water reached its highest point shortly after midnight. It did not crash against the shelter. It did not test the walls. It flowed around the slope, slowed, then followed the paths carved for it long before the storm began. Debris floated past and continued on, denied anything solid to strike. The pressure everyone feared never came, because pressure required resistance, and the shelter offered none. Inside, the night stretched long. People spoke in low voices, trading fragments of experience, as if assembling a shared understanding might make sense of what had happened. Someone described watching water rise through a basement floor like a living thing. Another spoke of a generator that failed just as the radio announced evacuation. A woman sat silently, staring at her hands, which still shook despite the safety she now occupied. Mark moved among them quietly, offering water, checking on children, adjusting airflow again when the shelter grew crowded with breath and body heat. He felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on his shoulders now. Opening the door had been the only choice he could live with, but it had changed everything. This was no longer his shelter alone. It was a promise he had to keep. At one point, the neighbor who had laughed sat beside him, his voice low. "I didn't believe you," he said. "I thought you were hiding, preparing for something that wasn't real." Mark did not answer immediately. He listened to the earth instead, to the quiet consistency that had made this moment possible. "I wasn't hiding," he said finally. "I was placing myself." The man nodded, eyes wet, understanding arriving too late to matter, but early enough to change something. As the hours passed, the shelter held. Moisture levels rose slightly with so many people inside, but never reached discomfort. Condensation did not form. The walls remained cool and dry to the touch. Children slept. Adults rested in shifts, their bodies gradually releasing the tension they had carried since the rain began. Sometime before dawn, the sound outside changed. The water did not retreat yet, but it stilled. The subtle movement that had filled the night faded, replaced by a quiet that felt tentative, as if the land itself were waiting to see what would happen next. Mark stepped to the door and opened it a crack, careful not to disturb the balance inside. The view took his breath away. Water covered nearly everything below the slope, smooth and reflective in the early light. Houses stood half surrounded, their shapes distorted by distance and reflection. Trees marked old fence lines like skeletal fingers reaching upward. The road was gone entirely, erased without violence, simply overwritten, but the slope remained dry. Mark closed the door and turned back to the people inside. They looked at him differently now, not with awe or gratitude exactly, but with the quiet recognition reserved for moments when assumptions fail completely. The shelter had done more than protect them from water. It had held time still long enough for fear to pass without turning into disaster. When the sun finally rose fully, pale and uncertain, it illuminated a landscape changed in ways that would not be undone quickly. But inside the earth, where Mark had chosen to trust what others dismissed, the night ended without loss. No one had drowned. No one had frozen. The water had come and found nothing to take. And in that absence, a new understanding had begun to form, one that would follow them long after the ground dried and life attempted to return to normal. The shelter had not conquered the flood. It had simply waited it out. And waiting, Mark knew now, was sometimes the most powerful act of all. The water did not leave all at once. It never did. It lingered the way it had arrived, reluctant, patient, testing the land as if deciding what it might keep. At first light, The surface below the slope lay still and heavy, reflecting the sky with a dull sheen that made distance hard to judge. Nothing moved except a few scattered branches drifting slowly, carried by currents too subtle to notice unless one watched closely. Inside the shelter, people stirred as the long night finally loosened its grip. Children woke first, confused by the unfamiliar space and the absence of windows. Adults followed more slowly, their bodies stiff from hours spent sitting or leaning against earth-packed walls. No one rushed for the door. Experience had taught them that safety, once earned, was not something to abandon lightly. Mark moved quietly among them, offering water, checking on the elderly couple who had arrived near dawn, making sure no one felt unsteady. He watched faces change as the reality settled in. They had survived the worst of it, not because help had arrived, not because the storm had spared them, but because they had been in the right place when everything else failed. By mid-morning, the water began to lower almost imperceptibly. It did not drain away like a released dam. It slid back into the land inch by inch, retreating from slopes first, clinging stubbornly to low ground. Mud emerged where water had been, dark and shining, already giving off the sharp smell of decay and renewal that followed every flood. Mark stepped outside again, standing on the firm ground above the mess below. The farmhouse still stood, though water had reached the bottom of its steps. The barn doors were stained with silt. Fences leaned at odd angles. Some snapped entirely where the ground beneath had softened too much to hold posts upright. It was damage, but not destruction. He had known that difference mattered. One by one, people followed him out, careful with their footing, silent as they took in the view. For some, it was the first time they had seen the extent of what had happened. From inside flooded houses, from boats, from isolated upper floors, the scale had been fragmented. From the slope, it was unmistakable. Entire stretches of road were gone. Fields looked scoured, their orderly rows erased. Equipment lay where it had been abandoned, half buried in mud like relics of a past that no longer fit the landscape. A woman began to cry softly, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what she saw. No one tried to comfort her with false assurances. Loss was real, and it deserved to be acknowledged. As the day wore on, the water continued its slow withdrawal. Emergency crews returned cautiously, their vehicles stopping where pavement ended and mud began. Officials took notes, photographs, measurements. They spoke in low voices, already framing reports and explanations. Mark answered questions when asked, explaining where the water had gone, how it had moved, why the slope had remained dry. He did not embellish. He did not claim insight beyond what the land itself had offered. Engineers arrived later, drawn by word of a structure that had not flooded despite being partially buried. They examined drainage outlets, traced channels, noted elevations. They tested walls for moisture and found none. They checked ventilation and found air clean and balanced. Everything they observed pointed to the same conclusion, one that unsettled assumptions without contradicting physics. The shelter had not been protected by chance. It had been placed correctly. By afternoon, people began leaving in small groups, returning to assess what could be salvaged, what would need replacing, what might never return. Some paused at the door, hesitating as if unsure how to thank Mark without turning gratitude into something awkward or insufficient. The neighbor who had laughed first stayed behind longest. He stood beside Mark on the slope, watching a boat pull away in the distance. "I thought higher was always safer," he said at last. Mark nodded. "So did most people." The man kicked at the dry earth with the toe of his boot. "You weren't trying to beat the water." "No," Mark said. "Just stay out of its way." The county declared the immediate danger over that evening. Power crews worked through the night restoring lines. Pumps ran again, though many had little left to drain. The river settled back into its channel, carrying with it debris and memory alike. By morning, birds returned cautiously, perching on fence posts that still stood, singing as if nothing remarkable had occurred. But nothing was the same. In the days that followed, assessments turned into decisions. Some families would rebuild. Others would leave, unwilling or unable to face the next season with the same uncertainty. Insurance representatives returned, this time with a different tone, speaking less of exclusions and more of mitigation. They asked questions about elevation, drainage, placement. They asked about the shelter. Mark shared what he knew. He drew simple diagrams on scrap paper, showing slopes and channels, explaining how water behaved when it was not forced to fight walls and foundations. He emphasized the importance of understanding ground before building on it. Some listened with urgency, others with skepticism softened by experience. The shelter became a reference point, mentioned in meetings and reports. It was photographed, measured, discussed. Not as a curiosity, but as evidence. Proof that adaptation did not always require new technology, only better attention. One afternoon, Mark returned alone to the shelter. It was quiet now, its purpose fulfilled for the moment. He ran a hand along the cool wall, feeling the steady presence of the earth beyond it. It had done exactly what he had trusted it to do. It had given time. Time to think. Time to choose. Time for fear to pass without turning into tragedy. Outside, the land began the slow work of recovery. Mud dried and cracked. Grass pushed through silt. Life asserted itself as it always did, indifferent to human plans, yet responsive to human humility. Mark stood on the slope and looked out over what remained. He did not feel triumph. He felt alignment, a sense that he had stopped arguing with the land and started listening to it instead. In the end, the flood would be remembered by numbers. Inches of rain, feet of water, dollars lost. Reports would be filed, lessons summarized, recommendations made. But for those who had knocked on one door in the dark and found it open, the memory would be simpler and deeper. When the water came, the ground did not save them. The understanding of it did. And in a world where extremes were becoming ordinary, that understanding was no longer optional. It was the difference between reacting and enduring, between building for appearances and building for reality. The water had come, it had tested everything, and then, quietly, it had let go.